I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'll be speaking today with Richard CIZIK, Executive Director of Evangelicals for Democracy, which aims to build a community of evangelicals across the political spectrum who champion democracy as an act of Christian faith. And you can learn more at Evangelicals for Democracy, all one word, evangelicalsfordemocracy.org. On Free Forum, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net, TerrenceMcNally, Terrence McNally, all one word, .net. In this crucial election year, in which democracy itself may be on the ballot, let me encourage you not only to get involved with the candidate campaigns that strike a chord with you, but also with efforts to fight voter suppression and assure that all Americans are able to exercise their right to vote. Now to today's conversation. I was brought up a Christian, a Catholic to be specific, 10 years of Catholic school, altar boy, choir. There was some period in my boyhood when I aspired to a priestly vocation. That seemed like, the best thing you could do with your life. And over the years, really beginning as I went off to college and so on, as I became more spiritual, I found I became less religious. But I've always been partial to the Sermon on the Mount, the Golden Rule, Christ saying, "Bring to me the poor, the sick, the children. Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. I give thanks daily for the gift of life and the moments of my life." And I now aspire to compassion, justice, forgiveness, what I see as the teachings of Christ. But at the same time as my views were evolving, so it seemed were those of evangelical Christianity, which has become way too synonymous with bigotry, intolerance, misogyny, often carelessness and cruelty, and has, through its alignment with the right, the Republican Party, come to exert considerable influence, I would say negative, even dangerous, considerable influence on our society. I say this show is about a world that just might work, and so I'm always looking for solutions. Well, I first heard of today's guest, Richard CIZIK, when I was quite actively involved with the issues of the environment, climate, energy, and so on. At the time, he led a group of Christians that saw our role as stewards of the earth and took climate change seriously. And those views actually led to his leaving another evangelical organization that he'd been part of for 28 years at the time. A friend recently recommended him to me. I said I wanted to do a number of shows this year that had specific bearing on the election, on voter suppression, on democracy, and so on. And so, a couple of decades after our paths first crossed, I welcome him to the show. Richard CIZIK, lobbyist, writer, clergyman, activist, is executive director of Evangelicals for Democracy, as I said, which aims to build a community of evangelicals across the political spectrum who champion democracy as an act of Christian faith. In 2010, CIZIK founded the New Evangelical Partnership for the Common Good, which advanced a new evangelical agenda with democratic principles at the core of public policy. Before founding NEP, he was vice president for governmental affairs of the National Association of Evangelicals, but in 2008 was pushed to resign after 28 years for publicly supporting civil unions and advocacy on climate change. Welcome, Richard CIZIK, to Free Forum, a world that just might work.
Wow. Thank you, Terrence. It's a pleasure to be with you. Talk about a world that might work. Wow. Now, that's a passion that I agree with. working together with other people to try and solve problems. I wonder where I had that idea growing up, but I did on the West Coast. In short, my story is this. Terrence, I grew up a
Oh,
farm kid.
let me just tell listeners, Richard, that we're recording this conversation Tuesday, April 23rd. Go ahead. So you're going to tell us about your path, young Richard to today's Richard, and some of the twists and turns along the way.
A little bit, yes. Not too much.
No.
I grew up on the West Coast, on a farm. My parents, a school teacher and a carpenter, thinking at the time that I was a nothing, a nobody in the middle of nowhere. I somehow had this passion inside of me that said, Richard, you have to become better than what you're expected to be. In other words, when I was in high school, my guidance counselor said, Richard, do you really want to go to college? I said, I definitely want to go to college. He said, I don't really know for sure you're college material. And I said, why would you say that? I'm in college prep classes and the rest. And he didn't persuade me that I shouldn't go, so I went off to college. But I left the farm, which was a pretty big decision. In other words, not to pursue life in a small town of 5,000, which would be easy. Become a farmer, become a local, not a global. Become something easy rather than something much more difficult if you were going to really join the big world. And so, past college, I pursued, I thought would be a career in politics because I wanted to make the world a better place. Went from Whitworth College, a Presbyterian school in Spokane, Washington, off to graduate school at the George Washington University, and thought, well, politics is a way to change things. It's a way to make life better for other people. It's a way to see the world in a bigger way than I had ever thought might be possible living in a small town of Quincy. By the way, 5,000 people today is regarded as one of the premier places for visitors to go. Turns out that, wow, the gorge, right on the cliffs of the Great Columbia River, is one of the most celebrated rock concert venues on the planet today, called the Gorge.
Wow.
Drawing people from around the world to Little Quincy. My goal, I knew I had to get out of the farm and see the world. My mother said to me after grad school, well, why did you have to go to China? I said, well, because I studied Mandarin in college. It seemed like a logical thing to do. See the life of the Chinese that you suggested. Maybe as a teacher I had to learn about, giving me The Good Earth to Read by Pearl Bach. Well, I thought I would pursue a career in politics, Terrence. I thought I would do that. I had at that point 2 degrees in political science. I loved the political process. I embraced it, I think. I thought it was the way to see change. And yet, living in Taiwan, because you couldn't go to mainland in 1975 to live as an American. You couldn't get a passport that would allow you in. Mao Zedong was still alive. I met 2 people in 1 year. Both were religious leaders. Both represented a broad, different world. One, the mainline Protestant world. The world I had sort of grown up in, Presbyterianism, mainline Protestant, Norman Vincent Peale. So as a Rotary graduate fellow, I sat at the table with Norman Vincent Peale.
Wow.
He said to me, he was the main speaker, I had to do my little gig in Mandarin. What are you going to do with your life, young man? And I said, Dr. Peale, I'm seriously considering changing my plans entirely. Instead of pursuing a career in politics or government, I think I'm going to go to seminary. And he said, best I can recall it, he said something to the effect, well, young man, God can use a few good diplomats. The second person I met was Billy Graham. It rained 5 days of a crusade in Taiwan, and I went every night. And being a young Christian at that point who had recently committed his life to Christ, it was a powerful experience. I wanted to meet the man. And it wasn't possible, I was told. The missionaries they were going to get the invites. A grad student, not even working in the field per se, wasn't going to get an invite. Well, as it turned out, I went to the airport after the Billy Graham crusade was over after 5 days and waited for a care package from my mother and met Billy Graham. And we had a short but interesting conversation in which he challenged me to pursue my God-given calling, whatever that might be. And so I did. I went to seminary and then ended up going to work for the Evangelicals, where I spent, as you said, 28 years. And my life today, wow, not exactly what I thought was going to happen.
Right.
Never in my wildest imaginations could I have imagined working for the Evangelicals, first of all. Second of all, doing it for 28 years. Thirdly, faithfully doing it, waiting for my time to take over, so to speak, the director of the Washington office, and then doing so and achieving some degree of success, only to be fired because I exceeded the boundaries of American evangelicalism at the time.
Yeah,
This
so
was
just so
2008. So that's my
Richard,
story.
Yeah, but so that people understand a little bit more, those 28 years, you were working as a lobbyist, a spokesman, a political operative, that sort of thing, in the Washington office of a national evangelical association, right?
Exactly.
Government affairs.
Yeah.
Now, when did you start that?
1980. Ronald Reagan came to Washington, and I had been in Taiwan when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, and I felt Jimmy Carter's response was weak, and I became a Reaganite early on, and so much so that in the first year there, I wrote a letter to the president and said Mr. President, you should give a speech on nuclear arms and the threat of the peace. It was the freeze, the peace freeze, as people called it.
Right.
And I didn't expect anything to come of it. And lo and behold, I got a phone call from the White House, and we didn't have cell phones in those days and hardly had faxes. And they said, well, we want you to come over to the old executive office building and meet the speechwriters. I said, wow, that's really something. So I did. And out of it came, a speech delivered by Ronald Reagan to the National Association of Evangelicals on March 6th of 1983 that became the Evil Empire speech.
Oh my gosh.
And this was the arc, it was the highest point of the arc of success that I could have ever imagined for myself at the time, that a guy who was at the bottom of the totem pole, a legislative intern practically in the Washington office, sees 1 million people in Hyde Park, 1 million people, Terrence, in Central Park protesting the nuclear freeze, and knowing what I thought at the time because of the expansion of Soviet involvement, not just in Afghanistan but around the world, the president needed to put this, though, in a manner, a phrase, a concept of worldview different than had been previously articulated, namely a spiritual frame. And realpolitik, that of Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon, that was never going to do that. The way to success was perceived to be détente, and we're going to live this way. We're going to, in fact, probably live the rest of our lives under the shadow of a nuclear war between these two powers, the United States and the Soviet Union. And that was the status quo, and we should just make the best of it. And my opinion was, I didn't believe that. I believed that if you put enough energy into this, enough spiritual energy, enough military energy, enough commitment, that Reagan's ideas and his ideals might in fact work. And in retrospect, I think in some measure they were responsible for the fall of the Soviet Union. But that was a kind of a turning point in my life to become a conservative more than I had in fact been in the past. And so it sort of kicked off a career, and eventually I was made the director of the office and broadened my attitudes a bit to work with other groups.
Let me ask one
Seeing
thing.
this,
What was the parallel evolution of Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority with your work in Washington?
uh, almost one laid on top of the other. In other words, one of my first actions was to attend the opening offices of the Moral Majority
There
on
you go.
Capitol Hill. Never forgot it. And so sat at the feet, so to speak, because this is what evangelicals were supposed to do at the time of Paul Weyrich and company.
Mm-hmm.
And so every week, at least an hour or two, or every other week at what was originally called Library Court, because we met halfway between the Smithsonian Building and and the Library of Congress and the Supreme Court. It was called Library Court, and so we met sometimes more than once a week in what was the origins of really Weyrich and others, Richard Viguerie, the religious right, and so that was my world for
So
a good many years.
you were present at the creation of what has grown, what we have seen ever
Yeah,
since has grown into the politicization
the
of
politicization of the evangelical movement.
the evangelical
Exactly.
movement.
Yeah, yeah. I
Exactly.
watched it and so my
Can you
boss.
tell? I want you to also what people who kind of have seen this around now since that period, that it was a move by the Republicans and certain people who saw, um, well, Nixon, um, whatever one may think of him, it was during the Nixon administration that the Environmental Protection Agency and
Yes,
OSHA,
yes, yes,
occupational safety, and things
yes.
like this were made into law, and he's signing those bills. And there was reaction in the Powell memo and Milton Friedman's statements that shareholders are the only, the shareholder enrichment is the only goal of business and so on. That this begins, and you are right there at sort of, as I say, at the seat of the creation where the Republican Party realizes that evangelical Christianity presents them an opportunity.
Exactly. Uh, I'll never forget watching my first boss. He was a Republican pastor who had run against Tim Worth, or
Mm-hmm.
would have run against Tim Worth in that congressional district in Denver area, Lakewood area, and lost. And the National Association of Evangelicals saw in him a potential director of the Office for Government Affairs, and so that's who the director of the office was. But he was mostly a pastor. I don't think he owned a passport,
Mm-hmm.
and didn't enjoy the same kind of I think inside view of politics that I just ate up and felt like it was the the best life I could live
Right.
practically, to
Here
be
you were able to
inside
join
on all of it.
your two kind of
Yeah,
passions.
and he said, I'm going to give you the boring job of going to the meetings on Capitol Hill, the messy business of lobbying, mostly about stopping change. That's what lobbyists do. I was interested in change, but the religious right was interested in stopping the changes that were slowly and inexorably occurring in America, and so Weyrich tutored me on a almost weekly basis, along with 25 others, on his view of government and the like. He was himself Eastern Orthodox Catholic, a very conservative man, and who assembled around him those who believed that the evangelicals could be a major factor in American politics, including particularly Republican politics. And he was tutoring us all the while on just how to do this and not do this. And I pretty much accepted my role as
Mm-hmm.
the bottom man on the totem pole for
Mm-hmm.
many years, though I have to confess, I had a sense this was this was misplaced optimism, a misplaced sense of the role of government, a bigoted attitude toward, among others, gays who at the time were suffering and others. And so I largely made changes when I could and kept my mouth shut when I couldn't until the time came in 1978 when he retired. 1998 when he retired. And
so and for people also to remember that the 80s is, and the Reagan administration is the period when AIDS is devastating the gay community, and prejudice against, well, back then, basically just gay people. There was no LGBTQ.
There was no movement of that sort.
Right. Was a big part of right-wing politics, and so the evangelicals became a big piece of that. You're saying that you saw that at some point there you had, it sounds like you had a little chafing, a little doubt in the back of your mind. But basically for 28 years you are part and of that movement.
Absolutely. And adopted some of its bigotry, which I have asked forgiveness for. But I changed slowly. In other words,
the next thing I was going to ask you was how did you change?
Well, first of all, I think it's important for listeners to understand that, evangelicals, our forebears, understood, first of all, that society was a covenant among persons and with God. And so if a ruler breached that covenant, the sovereign people could, remove him. And the assumptions were, one, government is fallen, it's imperfect, it's not the kingdom of God, and yet we have to try and work out, our own witness to God's vision. But remember, first of all, government is fallen, and second of all, unlike yourself growing up Catholic, for the evangelical Protestants, personal responsibility to come to the truth was done without priestly authority. And so the emphasis, you see, for the evangelical was each person's own story, their agency in salvation was what mattered. And that was a very different kind of attitude and worldview. But let me say, just finish the thought. This emphasis on each person's agency in salvation in our history was spurred on, in the early founding of the country by a sort of anti-authoritarianism, kind of localist anti-federalism, and Jeffersonian, Jacksonian politics, where clergy became figures in agrarian anti-landlord protests and the like. And so, a wariness of government and an adherence to a sort of a religio-cultural economic way of life that could exist almost in a silo for millions of evangelicals is what you bring to this rise, as I see it or saw it at the time, of the religious right. And some of it I was extremely uncomfortable with. But I think that understanding some of those foundations of what has contributed to the rise of the evangelical movement in the Republican Party is explained by those attitudes toward government.
I got it. That's one thing I realized just as when I booked you, I was thinking, about 2024. But I realized that the chance for me to have this conversation with someone who was there at the evolution of the religious right is, it just doesn't happen often.
The contemporary evangelical hatred, by some at least, to Dr. Fauci and his COVID mandates has a history. It goes all the way back to the anti-science views that led some in the Weyrich meetings to say, with books and the rest, well, HIV doesn't cause AIDS. AIDS is simply God's judgment on people.
Yes.
And I heard this all the time, and I said to myself, I don't believe that at all. And so when I eventually made a change that occurred in a number of years after I'd taken over the office in 1998. It was 2002. I had a conversion. I called it the second one. If the first one was to Christ, the second one was to the science of climate change, which I heard in Oxford at a conference. I began to, I began to see things in a light that helped me to understand that, some of the opposition, to big government that is rooted in, conservative opposition to climate change regulations is also rooted in a part and parcel of a toxic brew that includes, beliefs about science and evolution.
Mm-hmm.
And namely opposition to mainstream science. So no wonder if there is in this, first the rise of populism and then the Tea Party movement and now Trumpism, but there's something to be a linear kind of a line that runs through all of it. It's, among other things, you see, opposition to mainstream science, adherence to small government, and then for some outright hatred for so-called big government solutions. And also in that same toxic brew, which impacts upon immigration policy, sort of a suspicion of others and outsiders. And how I mentioned that earlier, there were, the body politic that the evangelicals adhere to is one which emphasized individual responsibility, a moral reckoning, and not least of all, a wariness of outsiders and authority. And so you see, going all the way back to the 1970s and the rise of the religious right to the present Trumpism, there's a path here.
Oh, absolutely.
There are themes which
well,
lead you to where we are today.
One thing it seems to me, Richard, is that there are beliefs or tendencies to beliefs or leanings, like you say, suspicion of government. If I'm an evangelical Christian, I may have a suspicion of others who are not Christian.
Yeah.
And you can take that seed, that leaning, that tendency, and it can be exploited. How much did you, when you were inside of it, understand and perceive and perhaps encourage that sort of building on a foundation to actually move to anti-tax, the abuse, in other words, small government, if it's meddling in your lives, I get that. But what it seems to me the evangelicals have been is they've been the troops for tax cuts for the wealthy and tax cuts for business. And when you go against regulation, what you're really going against often is science, consumer health, all those sorts of things. How much did you understand the way they were playing together, and how did you respond to that?
Well, I think I understood that that something was occurring here that had a history that goes way back to the founding of the country. In other words, a kind of Christian nationalism that was slowly moving into evangelical churches in ways that was going to, I perceived, make it more and more difficult even to find solutions to common good problems. Why? Because I didn't believe, because of the time I came to the Lord and personal faith, I didn't really believe that evangelicalism by itself meant that you had to hate gays. In fact, just the opposite. I believed that evangelicalism should teach love for all. And yet, what was occurring was that Christian nationalism, I think, did begin to impact the evangelical world in ways unheard of, even say 40 or 50 years ago, when evangelicals weren't even interested in politics.
That's right.
So my point was that, being an evangelical doesn't sour one to climate change realism, but if you're a politically conservative, Bible-believing Christian nationalist, that does. Mm-hmm. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, but I'm saying, so I'm saying as you were inside of it, and you originally your goal was to the betterment of society.
Right, do something good.
And politics might have been the path. It turns
Yes.
out that you end up in Washington, D.C., sort of where politics and evangelical Christianity come together. So you're kind of getting to do both. I'm curious how much you understood that the moral part of moral majority was a way of co-opting this community to support policies that had nothing to do with evangelical Christianity.
Of course, right away.
You did. You knew what you. You knew what you signed up for.
I knew what was occurring. Let me give you one little illustration. Sure. You have to understand, I was the low man on the totem.
Right.
But some of you may remember the Bob Jones University case, which was all about the right of private school institutions to retain their religious belief systems, including at Bob Jones attitudes about non-miscegenation. In other words, no dating and marriage across racial lines. Mm-hmm. And what the NAE had decreed when I came to work for it was that the association was going to support Bob Jones in its case. And I said to myself, wow, I think this is totally contrary to what evangelicalism should stand for. And yet the association's board, 100 members, had already signed on to this. Well, not long after I came to work for the NAE, we hired an attorney, a man who had served at the Internal Revenue Tax Exempt Division Office for 25, 30 years and wanted to retire and do something meaningful with his life. And together, the two of us persuaded the powers that be, though it took a few years, that being on the side of Bob Jones University was exactly the wrong place to be. It was to be on the side of bigotry and racism, and all that went with it. And yet, stepping out of the role I had sort of been given, which was to just don't question authority.
Right. You're to help us put forward what we've already decided.
My colleague and I successfully, we didn't get NAE's name off the original amicus brief to the Supreme Court in support of Bob Jones, but we ultimately withdrew from the whole cause, because those like Randall Ballmer and others who write today and have in years gone by, the instigating cause for the rise of religious right was never the pro-life movement. It was always about racism. Mm-hmm. It was always about the blacks, so to speak. And that was the first issue that sort of hit the fan for me, that, I knew where I was at, I knew my place, but I wasn't going to buy into all of it. And that was just the first of many. And gradually, over time, I said, no, I'm not going to buy into bigotry against gays either, because, by this time, a 30-year-old man, I had met enough to know I didn't believe that somebody could become gay by grooming. Yep. And I believed that people are born this way, and to discriminate against them was wrong.
And certainly unchristlike. Let me tell people.
And unchristlike.
Let me just tell people this is Free Forum, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking today with Richard CIZIK, lobbyist, writer, clergyman, activist. He's executive director of Evangelicals for Democracy, which aims to build a community of evangelicals across the political spectrum who champion democracy as an act of Christian faith. And you can learn more at Evangelicals for Democracy, all one word, evangelicalsfordemocracy.org. Let me push this slightly in a different direction. So you you notice yourself moving away on race, on anti-gay bigotry, and actually climate. And when you add climate to that, that's the point at which you no longer fit in the role you were in. Would you say that's correct?
Yeah, yeah.
And
But I didn't. But I didn't really know when I did an interview for Terry Gross
right.
in 2008, heading off to a conference that included Jimmy Carter and a few other evangelicals on Global Zero, the elimination of nuclear weapons. That in 2008, I was going to meet my Waterloo,
Yep.
so to speak. But I was asked after the interview, before I caught a plane to go out of the country, well, how did it go, Richard? Did you say something controversial again today? And I said, no, really. The office manager who I'd hired, Heather Gonzalez, I said, Heather, I didn't say anything.
Oh my
And I
gosh.
got over there, and all of a sudden I began getting emails from the NAE president saying, Richard, the reaction here in the States to you saying on that interview with Terry Gross that, one, you were for collaboration with the Obama administration, and in fact you even voted for Obama, number one. Number two, you believed civil unions were certainly constitutional, and it would be impossible to believe that if you accepted the 14th Amendment's free exercise, or 14th Amendment's due process and equal protection clauses, that you could then say you believed in those and then, deny men and women the right to date and marry of the same sex, right? So I said, first of all, I believe in the climate change science, anthropogenic climate change. I believe in equality, sexual equality.
Right.
In fact, evangelicals should stop worrying about whether gays date and start worrying about their own divorce rates. and then to top matters off, I said a few other things that riled the troops, so to speak, and got myself fired.
Yeah, when you go online and put in Richard CIZIK, this moment in your life and your career, you find an awful lot of references to it. Let me ask you, having seen yourself grow in the way you grew, and I would say that in fact what you then found was your truer calling, which was to still act among evangelicals, to still act in a political sphere, but with a different set of goals and a different set of beliefs. But let me ask you, you sort of hinted to it before, and if you say that's all I want to say, that's fine. But you said there was a suspicion of government and a suspicion of outsiders, which made evangelicals ripe for the actions of the right and the Republican Party. Anything else about why you think, let me tell you one thing that I think, which is I don't think, or it doesn't have to be necessary that white evangelical Christians are more white supremacist, more bigoted, more Christian nationalist than other people. There's plenty of, you probably know the statistic, but the Democratic candidate has not won a majority of the white voter in 40 or 50 years. It's not just evangelical Christians. What I think makes evangelical Christians such a visible participant on that side is that they're organized. The civil rights movement organized itself in the black churches. This is smart politics. If you have a political goal, where do people who agree with us collect so
Yeah,
that instead of influencing one person at a time, we can move entire
sure,
groups? Does that
Oh, yeah.
make sense to you?
Perfect sense. So much so that there are people now who, according to the Public Religion Research Institute and Pew and other surveyors, find that there are those who identify themselves as Muslim evangelicals or Buddhist evangelicals or, of one sort or another, who are conservatives. They're not really evangelicals. It's like Orrin Hatch, senator from Utah, and I were friends. And Orrin Hatch would always tell me, Richard, I'm an evangelical. And I would say, I believe that. I can accept that. Well, the point was, there are now what are called, evangelicals in name only. You've heard of Republicans in name only or rhinos. Now, these are evangelicals in name only. These are people who are conservatives who like the evangelical worldview in some respects, who aren't really converted followers of Jesus, but they like the evangelical attitude, and particularly they like evangelical politics as it's described to them by the media. And so they go there and they find a home, and maybe they'll even find Jesus.
Oh, right.
But the point is, the evangelical term is now a political term.
Yeah, sadly so.
And sadly so. And these conservatives who are suspicious of government, probably hate outside foreigners, adhere to Trumpism in so many respects, they're total frauds when it comes to what is true evangelical faith. But because the evangelical movement as a whole does not reject, doesn't reject them, in fact, invites them in and says, you are one of us, and end result of which is that America and American conservatives have changed evangelicalism more than evangelicalism has changed conservatism.
Absolutely. So let me ask you this question, and then we're going to turn to Evangelicals for Democracy, how you formed, what you're doing, and how people can learn more. But the question is, when I talk to friends and siblings, and I said, so I'm interviewing, this guy who's been sort of a renegade evangelical now for a while, started with climate. Now he's got this organization, in fact, at Evangelicals for Biden in 2020. What would you ask him, right?
Yeah.
And it seems to me that one of the things that comes up for people the most is, how do evangelicals, not necessarily leaders, not necessarily organizations, but evangelicals themselves, how do they square all of this? And some people focus on Trump, thrice married, adulterer, grifter, how can you, right, all that. But I think it's much more than Trump. It's basically, how do you say, I live my life according to Christ's teachings, and then be a bigot, be intolerant, be cruel to immigrants, when you have, and I'm sure you've had hundreds of these conversations over the last 40 years, how do they do that? How does it all fit?
I was befuddled as you are and outsiders because I'm sitting across the table at a coffee shop with a pastor of 40 years, former member of the board of the National Association of Evangelicals, and he says to me, you don't really want to tape this, do you? I said, well, if you'd let me tape it, I wouldn't identify you. He says, okay. So I said, tell me, Dwight, I said, do you really believe in the First Amendment? And he said, no. Oh. I said, well, how do you square that with your faith? He said, well, look, this was a country founded by Christians, and Christians should have the greatest say in its laws and policies. And I frankly like Trump because of his Muslim ban and the rest. Started out that way, and I really don't even believe in the First Amendment. And I said, oh. So you're willing to deprive other people of their religious beliefs in this country that prides itself on the First Amendment. But when it comes to your deprivation of religious free speech rights, well, then holy hell, then there's going to be a fight. We know that. And so he said, well, it's just the way I am, Richard. It's what I believe. And I said, you can't change. By the way, my philosophy is that people change both by conversion and by dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really important. Dialogue is really important, and we Americans have lost the art of it. And
Yeah.
fortunately, because of my history and background, I'm usually pretty good at communicating with somebody who disagrees with me. And so I'm. By the way, you want to talk about democracy, and we'll get there. But let me say this: people change their minds in a transformational way. It goes like this. They have to move from deny, I won't change my mind, to deliberate, I might change my mind, to design, okay, I will change my mind. And doing, that's the fourth D, I am changing my mind. And lastly, 5, I've changed my mind. And I got this from a professor friend, Bob Doppelt, who wrote a book called The Power of Sustainable Thinking, and Bob's a Buddhist. And a wonderful man. And he said, we're going to move this planet from take, make, waste to, borrow, use, and he had originally designed it to be return, and he decided he liked my word replenish better. So we're going to, move the planet from take, make, waste to borrow, use the resources of the earth and replenish. But in other words, people change. They do change. I am convinced there are 43% of the public, Terrence, today is in the sort of the category of the middle. These are, according to writers, I recently read, in fact, I was supposed to be at Earth X today, actually. And my schedule got messed up, and I'm not there in Dallas. But I read, and like Trammell Crow and Bill Shireman's book, In This Together, how Republicans, Democrats, capitalists, and activists are uniting to tackle climate change and more. But my point is, people do change, but there are a lot of forces, including the political process, that militate against change.
Yeah.
And so I change my mind, and I think other people can change their mind.
Okay.
And I try to move people on it. But to answer your basic question, how does one reconcile one's Christian faith, as my friend who says, they don't deserve First Amendment rights. We're here first.
Oh my God.
I don't know. There are people in the evangelical world, 1/3 of which in our Evangelicals for Democracy movement, we understand are never going to change.
Okay.
They are a third are set in stone. But that still leaves, two-thirds that might be. And to get somebody to the place where they deliberate, I might change my mind. And I was once on a program at the National Academy of Sciences with a climatologist, a neurologist, and a few others. And one of them said to me, you realize, of course, Richard, that you changed your mind, but you began changing your mind long before you gave that interview to Terry Gross. I said, I know you're right. He said, I'm a neurologist, I can tell you. You began changing your mind probably 7 years prior to when you made it public with Terry Gross. And I said, I think you're right. And so you have to be open to change. And, that's why as part of the work we're doing now, we, Evangelicals for Democracy, we subscribe to the theory that if we claim the right to influence, we must accept the responsibility not to inflame. And so attacks and name-calling don't work to change these evangelicals. And so we try to use inspirational, faith and fact-based, nonpartisan messaging.
Well, I think the most interesting thing when I read the description of what Evangelicals for Democracy aims what their aims are. The most interesting phrase to me is not build a community of evangelicals across the political spectrum who champion democracy. It's who champion democracy as an act of Christian faith. In other
Yeah,
words,
yeah,
you're not
yeah.
merely saying that you can give up your right wing bigotry and intolerance and all of that, and that's enough. You're saying that actually Christianity, that true democracy is
An act of faith.
is an act of faith.
Yeah,
Exactly. That
yeah,
it's not just neutral. It's
right.
actually an act
Yeah.
of faith.
And so
And
that's part of the.
you have this. I want you to actually go through that sort of. You did it with how people change, but that step by step, verify, ordain,
Dane,
empower,
power, and
that'll give people a
so
sense
the first of all, that person sitting at the table with me, we have to agree upon certain facts, and so the first is we have to verify what is truth, and we live in a society like Kelly McEnany said, I have my what are called
alternative facts.
alternative facts. So that's what we live in today with Donald Trump and all of his cohort. So anyway, that's what we deal with. And so first of all, vote. The V is to verify.
Yep.
Verify the facts. And if we can get to some agreement there and work on that, wow, come together, that would be terrific. Secondly, ordain. We believe that while the Bible doesn't prescribe any one form of government, it certainly favors, if you build it out, the principles that is, a democracy. It's just naturally simpatico. So that's the ordain. And so we believe that our faith ordains us to do this. If you see where I'm going here, the
Yes,
T is the VOT. The V is
I got it.
to teach. So our goal is to teach people and what do we want to teach them? Well, we want to teach them about democracy, of course, and what it means, but we have a whole lot of other things we want to teach them, and we have blogs on topics that range from Christian nationalism to women's health issues. So that's the teach part, and then lastly, empower. And so that means to act more boldly. Actually, I have another little acronym because I went to seminary, and you have to reduce a sermon, to 10 minutes.
Right.
It goes like this. I want people to, first of all, see and think more clearly. See and think more clearly. That's the vision part of it. The strategy is to care more deeply, and the tactics are to act more boldly. And if you, for example, if you want to think about the vision part of this, if you think it can't be done, if we can't preserve democracy in this country, if we're lost to the autocrats, the authoritarians, and the religious right, then we are lost. So don't let the hurdles get in the way, So that's the vision. And the second part of this, which is the strategy, I really think it is recognizing that we have to care, and the way you care, I think, is through love. And if you can love people, everything else will change. And so we don't use in our strategy, we don't attack, the Trumpers, but we do put ads in far right websites like Breitbart. We go right where they're at and try and appeal to them on a spiritual sort of a heart level, not a head level. So that's the part of the strategy we have. By the way, I happen to think that the human brain, it's said, privileges experiences over analysis.
That sounds right.
So the lady who looks out her kitchen window and says, "Hey, spring has come a lot earlier this year," may be on our way to reckoning with, climate change. But, so we try to use through our strategy, good psychology.
So
Yeah.
in 2020, you had Evangelicals for Biden.
Yep.
And you say that you moved about 350,000 faith-based former Trump supporters, which is a significant in both Georgia and Michigan, key swing states, to vote for Biden. This time you do not have Evangelicals for Biden, am I correct? It's Evangelicals for Democracy. My
Well,
guess is
yes,
it
yes.
creates a bigger tent potentially.
Yes.
And what are your goals for this election year?
Well, our goals are to persuade evangelicals in the key 11 swing states to vote for pro-democracy candidates and policies. We have to say it that way to be candid, because we are nonpartisan.
Right?
But if you are trained, and we are trained, we aimed in partnering with the Southwest Voter Registration and Education Project, which has a record of having in the past registered over 8 million Latinos. We're doing it this year with them by election day to register 2 million. So we're aiming to teach them, as well as voter register in those 11 states, 2 million new voters. But lastly, empower them to actually vote and get someone else to vote for pro-democracy candidates.
And
And
I
that
think,
means
yeah.
if you were a denialist, never mind climate denialist, although we would vote against a climate denialist, if you are an election denialist who says that Joe Biden didn't win in 2020, then we're telling you in effect, don't vote for that candidate. If it's in Arizona and you got a choice between Kerry Lake and
Ah,
Mr. Gallegos, let's be very specific about this. We're telling you, we're not telling you who to vote for, but we are telling you what to vote for. Vote for pro-democracy.
yeah. In other words, the split has become so clear that you can actually say that it's just vote for democracy, and a lot of other things will follow from that.
Right.
It was while we were talking that I sort of realized, wait a minute, this is this is a rare guest. I tend not to reach out to the people that I vigorously disagree with. I, you know what I'm saying? I've been doing this for 25 years now, and
It's
my
very
goal.
impressive, too.
Thank you. My goal is to learn while teaching, teach while learning, and expand the value of the people that I speak with and all of that. And so I don't usually speak to right wingers that much. I tried it a more at the start, and it just wasn't fulfilling.
It's terrible.
Yeah. And so
It's
to be
really
able to
hard.
have someone like you who's had a St. Paul conversion.
Hey, but let's face it. I did say, if there's 1/3, there's no point in even having a
That's right.
conversation.
That's right. Yeah.
But
Yeah,
the
exactly.
2/3, and I believe that evangelicals. I know that there are those we persuaded in 2022 not to vote. Just don't vote for the denialists. If they say they didn't believe, in the election of 2020, if they're denialists, just don't vote for them. You don't have to vote for the Democrat. Just don't vote for them. And if you can persuade enough evangelicals in 5 states not to go down the rabbit hole of, Donald Trump and QAnon and, all the ridiculousness that I hear, enough evangelicals, and it doesn't take that many in those 5 states to keep us from losing what we have. I think it can be done, and I believe it's going to be done.
And what you're also saying, it sounds like, is that you've got a feeling
Yeah.
that things are shifting, that something
Yeah.
about the trials and
Yep.
seeing him as this sort of frustrated old man sitting,
Yeah. Yep.
it just, some of the invincibility, some of the of him as your avatar, right?
Yeah.
Has
I think that's exactly right.
So what we're going to see over the next, what is it? We're about to enter the 5th month, so we got basically 6 months to the election, right?
Yep, yep,
We're going to see more of him exposed at the same time as people start paying more attention to the election.
exactly.
And I think the point you just made is a very good one. Okay, you don't like Biden. He's too old. I mean, I don't understand. We all, I'm sure you agree with me that what the Biden administration has done for the environment, for people with student debt, for infrastructure, on and on, is actually more. I mean, you give credit to Obama for
Yeah,
health care, but other than health care, Biden has been the most progressive president
yeah,
since Johnson or Roosevelt.
right. And maybe in the end, we'll have, as political scientists already say, a legislative record that rivals LBJ and maybe even FDR.
And at a
Uh,
time when the challenge of achieving that is so much more difficult.
exactly.
But people don't get it, and the Biden administration somehow hasn't been able to penetrate enough with what we've done for you. But I think I think I may agree with you
Yeah.
that
Well, I
it's
was,
going to be gradual.
by the way, in 2016, in a month before the election, I was at a board meeting of an organization I'm no longer on the board of because I served my 6 years, but the Public Religion Research Institute board meeting in Washington was occurring, and I was the only one out of about 10 who said, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want to disagree with all of you, but I truly believe that, Donald Trump's going to win this one. I felt the same way when I was sitting with a group of NAE leaders awaiting the verdict on the OJ trial, and every one of them in the office said, of course he's guilty. He's going to be convicted. And I said, no, you're wrong. You're wrong. He's going to get a pass. We didn't even know the term jury nullification, but I said he's going to get a pass for all the wrongs done to blacks in this country for so long. And, I wouldn't say what I'm saying now, and didn't say 6 months ago or even, a year ago, but I think the combination of the abortion issue
Yeah.
and other factors may pull this out for Joe Biden, and I pray so because so much is at stake.
Yeah, exactly.
It's interestingly enough, we ran an ad in the legislative district where I live in Fredericksburg for the 27th district to support a black pastor for the state delegate, and we ran it often enough that we got analytics that over 200,000 people viewed it, and he won 53-46. We're going to Evangelicals. Whether it's the 8th congressional district where you have a Latina, she's a medical doctor who won barely by 1,500 votes 2 years ago, 8th congressional district in Colorado. She's running, and in those races, we're running ads. We've already started. Sound Off Films in Hawaii and California. It's run by Kevin Costner's daughter. Is amazing. Sound Off Films is starting to do our ads, so we've got some really great ads coming up. But we're going into those parts of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and we're just gonna. I don't know. I suspect we'll run at least $500,000 worth of ads.
Great, 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 great.
I think we're gonna have enough money to really target in this election in ways that will do some good.
Yeah. So if you wanted to tell people how to learn more, how to get involved, how, what would be this is your sort of closing statement on how to work with you to make sure that democracy wins
Well,
in November.
every politician says, when he gets on television, he says, go to my website. Well, we've listed our website, but what we want you to do is to go to the website for a purpose, which is to better understand how to talk to evangelicals in order to persuade them. Because if you look at the numbers, Terrence, it's 0.000625. It's a very, very small number of voters in 5 states that will determine the outcome of democracy in America, and that's what's at stake. That means if you're in any one of those states, boy, do we want to talk to you. But most importantly, if you believe what we believe, you've got to go to your neighbor and your family members and everybody else and persuade them that democracy is on the line, because I believe it is.
And so there's kind of there's 3 things there. 1, democracy is an act of faith. Democracy is ordained. 2, it's in danger. And 3, you can help save it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And since you're out of time, let me just close with a benediction that comes from a Methodist, John Wesley, who said, to serve the present generation, my calling to fulfill. Oh, may it all my powers engage to do my master's will. Arm me with jealous care as in thy sight to live, and oh, thy servant lead, prepare a strict account to give.
Okay. I don't know how many other shows we've closed with a benediction, so thank you, Richard. Again, the organization is Evangelicals for Democracy, and the website is evangelicalsfordemocracy, all one word, .org. And as Richard said, up there, they've worked hard on how do you talk about Christian nationalism? How do you talk about free speech? How do you talk about democracy? How do how can you get through to people? That's what they're attempting to do on that website, evangelicalsfordemocracy.org. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to terrencemcnally.net, TerrenceMcNally, terrencemcnally.net, or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. They're the same website. If you want to receive my weekly email announcements telling you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and usually links to 10 to 15 articles relevant to that conversation or just relevant to that week, email me at temcnally, TEMCNALLY, at mac.com. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform Podcast on Apple Podcast and at most major podcast sites. You'll find years of podcasts. Michael Lewis, Naomi Klein, Bill McKibben, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Greg Boyle. You can also follow me on Twitter or X, I guess, at McNally Terrence, McNallyTerrence. Thanks to Kiana Williams in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all, you, my listeners, please share this podcast widely. And finally, thank you, Richard CIZIK. Keep up your good work.
Thank you, Terrence. God bless you.